I think what's really helped me is my work speaks for itself. Like, it doesn't matter how old I am, what I identify as. Like, I actually see them as values. I have such a nuanced way of thinking because of all of the intersections, because I'm adopted, because I was raised by immigrants, because I'm queer, because I grew up in certain areas. Like, that's all valuable. The more life experiences that we have, the more value we can bring, because it makes us understand so many more perspectives.
What's up, you guys, and welcome back to school. But don't worry, everything is cool. I'm your host, Julyssa, and of course, I am here with the boys, Steve and Brandon. Say what's up, you guys.
What's up?
And we have a special guest today. We got Karina from Drafted.
Hello.
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 Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Thank you for coming.
Of course.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. I know we were talking a little bit before the show that you're from Orange County. So tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, I can take you all the way back. So I was actually born in Asunción, Paraguay, which most people don't know where that is, but it's a small little country right in the smack dab middle of South America. Was born there, and then had the privilege, really, to be adopted when I was about 8 months old, and was brought by my parents, who are two amazing humans who, funny enough, are immigrants from Cuba, who came actually at different points, and raised in Southern California. So I always make the joke that I was destined to be Latina because I just had no other way around it. But growing up, I grew up in a very traditional, if you will, immigrant Cuban household. Celia cruz, frijoles negro, yuca frita. I have it both on both my sides. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful. My younger sister's also adopted. So we were this international family. She's born in Moscow, Russia.
Oh, wow.
And so we're from all over the place. We used to always make the joke that, the only person born in the country was our dog. But anyways, growing up, loved sports. I can't remember a time that I didn't love sports, which is funny because my parents really weren't huge sports fans. Played soccer my whole life, and then carried that fandom in my adulthood. But really before, and all of that, I for the most of my career, I spent at the intersection of culture and storytelling. When I was 22 years old, I found out I had ADHD, which on its face feels very simple, but really made it really difficult for me to keep a job. So I had 3 different jobs in less than a year, and really kind of made the decision that if I continued to keep getting hired and fired, or almost hired and fired every single time, that I would have a terrible resume. So I took a step back, and then I started to work for myself. I took what little bit I knew, and turned some freelance jobs to a bigger, and before I knew it, I had an agency. So I built that agency for about 6 years. And it was all about how to tell authentic cultural stories in mass media. So we work from anywhere from small brands that were just getting started to some of the biggest Latino-owned brands in the country, and helping them navigate their story and their brand presence. And that's where I really fell in love with storytelling and the impact it could have. Particularly when you're talking about a demographic that hasn't had the opportunity to be in mass media. For me, that was personal because when I came out at 16, which was really difficult, we can talk about that in a second, but there just wasn't people that looked like me, especially being at this intersection of Latin and queer. And so, I made it my personal mission to make sure that other people felt seen in the stories that were being told. But the thing about having an agency is that you work on a million different projects, and it's wonderful, but you never really get to build your own. And I wanted to do something that was really aligned with my passions, that I had full control over. And so that's when, in early 2023, I started to kind of make the direction to build what is now Drafted, which is the first and really only Latina sports media company, all about driving access and representation for essentially Latinas who have been virtually ignored or invisible in sports up until now. So that's a little bit of like the 360 view of where I am and where I come from.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack right there.
Yeah.
So I know that you talk about a lot of, representation and all that. So how would you say that you engage with the Latino community to ensure that their voices are being heard and represented?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways. And so I guess the first part of it is when we started Drafted, the biggest thing we wanted to fix was the lack of representations in our stories. You know, we're sitting, right now is Hispanic Heritage Month, so it feels like a bombardment of our stories. But the reality is that we know this. We are making change and impact and doing incredible things 365 days out of the year. And especially in sports, which is so cultural to us. You know, I'm Cuban, so baseball, boxing is big. South America, Mexican soccer is big. I mean, it's such a cultural thing. And so the way that we wanted to do that was it was so important to be a media company, to be able to tell those stories and have autonomy and ownership of those stories and not rely on mass media to only highlight, the 2 or 3 athletes that are Latino or Latinx during certain times of the year or during the Olympics. We wanted to be able to have the privilege to tell those stories 365 days. And so I think that's the proudest way that we show up for our community. There's a lot of different ways that we do that more personally and in person, but I think it has to start with media. I mean, we say it all the time and you hear it all the time. If you see it, you can be it. And so how can young women aspire to be chief operating officers at, major sports teams if they don't know that there's women and Latinas that are actually taking those seats? How can you aspire to be an Olympian or a front cover athlete if you don't know about the athletes that are already doing it? And so that was part of our thesis, is we had to start with telling those stories and bringing them to the forefront to hopefully create that ripple effect, because I'm sure all of us have a story that inspired us to do something because we saw a version of ourselves, whether it's cultural or they have a similar background or they worked in a similar position as you, that inspired us to do something. And that was our goal, was to do that with sports for Latinas.
Yeah. And I mean, you can also see with a lot of sports, like in specific with baseball, even like their fans.
Yeah.
Like majority of the fans are Latino fans too.
100%.
Or like they're very in different, cultures and
Right.
backgrounds.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
I think having that engagement as well and seeing it on media of like, oh, I feel seen or I feel heard.
Right.
Because I feel like that's another important part, is that not only like if if they're throwing like these different, I guess, events, right? And these different sports and media, like how do you represent that if you don't have somebody who's in that specific, company to actually represent them?
Because it feels fair. Like the first example that I can think of is the Dodgers. Like the Dodgers has a huge like Mexican American fan base. And I feel like when I grew up and was able to buy my own ticket and go, it felt like kind of like a safe space where I feel like I'm surrounded by people who are generally from my community, from the city I'm from, supporting the same teams that I do. And so it feels like kind of like if teams need to be more aware of that, like in terms of both the organization and the players, because I feel like, we support them and hopefully they can support us, because that it just feels so much more seen and feels much more validating all around, and I could see if somebody is like a young baseball player who is a Mexican American and felt like the Dodgers was like the safe place, it might inspire them to then see that as an actual career instead of feeling alienated or alone.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. And I feel like, especially sports, it's a really diverse setting. I guess I feel like it gets really overlooked. I mean, I'm a big basketball fan. So, I mean, if you look at basketball now, everybody's from all over the world. Like if you watch the Olympics, more than ever, there was a star player playing for a country that wasn't America. So I think it's really important to hear about, even players' backgrounds too. So I really like that.
Yeah. Well, I think that was part of what we really wanted to build, was like, Drafted is focused on the sports ecosystem, which means we don't just talk about the fan experience or the athlete experience or the executive experience. We talk about all 3 parts, because you need all 3 in order to make change. You can't just rely on the fans to make it more equitable if the people in the decision-making seats aren't like them. There's a reason why the Dodger feels like an extension of home, because the people who are making the decisions come from backgrounds of likely a LA culture, maybe grew up here, probably are Latino, and that's intentional. So that gets translated into the fan experience, so someone like you feels safe and seen. But if those people sitting in those seats aren't thinking about the actual Latino or LA community, then there's a massive disconnection. And so it's about all 3 parts playing their pivotal role to make it a better system.
Yeah. And I want to continue to go a little more on like you working, in the industry. I think something that sometimes maybe some people face is, you know, other people not being supportive. So some people within your culture also not being supportive. You know, we get the criticism a lot sometimes.
Yeah.
And I kind of just wanted to know if you've ever faced that and how have you overcome that challenge?
Oh God. Yes. The short answer is yes. Where do I start? You know, I think there's a couple of things. So I think traditional corporate America, you know, because we started as a B2B business. We're a media company, so a big part of the way that we make money is we work with brands who want to advertise through our content or through our programming. And so we're often speaking to, you know, that B2B, whether it's an agency or somebody in-house. And so there have been a number of times where, you know, that Latino or Latina sitting in that decision-making seat isn't a champion for us. And that's always incredibly discouraging because we always feel like they're the ones that should be raising their hands and saying, oh, I believe in what they're doing because I live it every day. You know, and that's been one of the toughest battles is when you're kind of disappointed by one of your own who you think is going to raise their hand and advocate for you. And I think it's an old way of thinking where, you know, particularly in corporate America, there's only a seat for one Latino or one person of color. And so I don't blame them when they're afraid to take a quote unquote risk by betting on something that is still new and kind of innovating. But it's incredibly discouraging because if they're not thinking about our people, then nobody's going to be thinking about our people. But on the other hand, I think there's been a number of champions who have put their neck on the line and raised their hands and said, okay, we want to work with them instead of an incumbent agency or instead of incumbent media company because we believe in what they're doing and they're not afraid to take that risk for us. But I think it's always hard when it's one of your own who kind of turns their back against you. And you know, I wish I had knew or I wish I had the tools to tell you this is how we deal with it. You know, I think it's hard not to take it personal. Yeah. And that's the difficult part, you know. But at the end of the day, like we all have a reason why we are afraid to take risks, whether it's job security or working really hard to get somewhere and not being or fear or shame. And so I don't blame them for having a little bit of an older mentality where, you know, I mean, we have immigrant parents that told us to come here and, you know, play it safe and do the right thing and don't be too loud, get the promotion, accept the jobs. And so I think there's just a cultural shift that needs to change that I think the younger generation is doing a really good job of not being afraid of being themselves and advocating for.
Yeah, I totally get it too, because I think we sell ourselves shorts, but also there's that fear of standing out, and that's like the whole point, you know?
Yeah.
Right.
You're supposed to advocate for your community, but I think that, like you said, there's this idea that, you know, there's only a certain amount of positions that are for our marginalized group. And so to think like anything I say or do could just maybe mess up my opportunity and then I'll lose it, you know?
100%.
So I don't blame people who are super afraid of it. But I like you said, I do think there's this new wave of this younger generation being like, no, I think risking your job security is sort of part of the risk, right?
Yeah.
Right.
You know, you're supposed to pave the way for anybody else who's in the future. You know, people stand on the shoulder of giants all the time.
100%.
Yeah. And I feel like the way you said it was really nice to hear because I think I personally have kind of gone through that. I mean, specifically, I've been working, you know, in the entertainment and sports industry and seeing that even people within our culture, it's sometimes hard. But I think I've sort of had that understanding that I think it's really hard just sometimes because it's a hard industry, especially when it's predominantly, you know, very white centric and very like it's hard to be in those spaces. Right. So I feel like I've come into this like understanding of like it's hard already enough to get there and it's not something against me. It's more just like because of the way that these industries have been built, they're not built for women and especially women of color. Right. So it's like I have that further understanding of like it's just hard enough.
Yeah.
And you are scared of like I did all this work to then just like
lose it all.
Lose it
Right.
all. And I think I understand that now. And I think the way you said it too is very like eye opening of like, you might not have the advice, but it's just like just seeing, you know, the other perspective of like, this is what it is. Right. And yes, like, of course that can be hurtful, but I think sometimes it's not really that personal of it. Right. You know, it's just more of like, this is just where we are and where we were put that we kind of are. And eventually I think, like how you said, like, I think now there is a little more of advocating for each other and like being there for each other. But I think because we've had that mindset of like, I have it, I can't lose it, and just like fighting for whatever I have to fight for against whoever that is. I think that's just like the hard part for some people sometimes.
But it is hard not to take it personal, I think.
Of course.
Yeah.
People,
Oh, yeah.
You know? You're like, what the hell?
Yeah, like we're already facing the same obstacles and you're still adding another one there.
Yeah.
You know, that seems so unfair because it's like, why? You know, we should be bringing people up, but easier said than done, I guess.
Well, I guess because it's, I think if I'm speaking on my own personal thing, I feel like what's heartbreaking is that I think when you're this person who advocates for your community, but then to kind of like not actually help your community when they actually
push comes to
ask
shove,
you,
right? Yeah. When it's finally time to actually do it, that's when you're like, you get cold feet.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's where it's kind of a little heartbreaking because I thought we were more of a collective than in like being individualistic. But I mean, again, like, it is like something personal, but it's also like, you know, there's just other factors to it.
Yeah, you don't know what someone went through. Maybe it was like their family, their immigrant parents. Because like you said, we all have immigrant parents, and there is that rhetoric of like, you know, take what you can because, you know, there's a scarcity in our community. So like, if you get this position, you know, just play what do you say? Play it straight.
Right.
You know, just go forward. Don't make noise. Don't bring attention to yourself.
Yeah. And I guess going a little more into that, like, how have you built your confidence in your identity? Like you said, you're, you know, is it properly to say queer Latina? Yeah. Okay. So as a queer Latina, and like, how have you kind of, you know, accepted yourself and shown that to other people?
It's been a journey. I mean, you know, so I think I shared. So I started my first company at 22. I mean, like most people are still interning at 22, and I all of a sudden was running a company. You know, and so there was a lot of learnings. You know, I always make the joke that I was like still the entry level job with like, but I was hired to be the expert, and I had to like balance those two. But I think in doing that, like it was almost like I had no other choice but to understand the role that I needed to play as a leader of a company and use that to my advantage. But it's been really difficult because I think even now I'm 30 years old, and most rooms even still I'm the youngest person. I'm the youngest person, and then to top it off, like I am such an advocate for self-expression, and I think self-expression is a lot of times what you wear, how you dress, what your hair looks like, and so I don't feel comfortable in like traditional like you know, corporate setting or corporate attire. That's not what makes me feel powerful. So like you add being young, and then you add not wanting to like adhere to corporate, you know, America standards, and it paints a picture of somebody who is not professional, maybe not experienced enough, and so it's been a really difficult becoming and unbecoming. But I think what's really helped me is my work speaks for itself. Like it doesn't matter how old I am, what I identify as, like, I actually see them as values. I have such a nuanced way of thinking because of all of the intersections, because I'm adopted, because I was raised by immigrants, because I'm queer, because I grew up in certain areas. Like that's all valuable. The more life experiences that we have, the more value we can bring because it makes us understand so many more perspectives. And so I use that to my advantage. And I think in doing that, that built a lot of confidence. And I think the more that you do something and that you prove to yourself that you can do it, then it doesn't matter how you look. It doesn't matter what you are. It shouldn't matter, right? It sometimes it does, but it shouldn't. And so it was all about just kind of stacking that resume. And even that, though, is kind of toxic. Because I think especially as women or people of color, like we feel like we have to have a resume that like comes all the way down to the ground to say, look, I'm worthy now. Like now I'm worthy to sit where you sit. And that was something I wish I didn't have. I wish I didn't have to feel like I had to like overexert all of my experiences and all of my nuances to show people that I'm worthy, and I'm just worthy because I'm worthy. Yeah. But it's really difficult. But, you know, I think with time you find your people, and you find your non-negotiables. For me, it's a non-negotiable is how I dress, because like nothing makes you feel more confident or insecure than dressing in something that does or doesn't work for you, right? Like, I mean, how many, like, you can probably adhere, like, you've been somewhere and you're in a tight dress or something tight and you just feel out of your body.
Yeah.
And so for me, that's a non-negotiable. Like, I will dress how I want to dress, and that's what makes me feel powerful. So I think it's a combination of like just like having to build in your own confidence, but also like just having to put yourself in situations that make you uncomfortable, that build that confidence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful message too. Because I think it's easy to look at like your background or your cultural background, or even like, you know, your gender identity, whatever you have, and see it as a disadvantage. But I like that you say it is an advantage, because
Right.
it's true. Because they say, you know, struggle creates a better person, creates a stronger person.
Right.
So I think it's kind of very similar to that philosophy, because I think that like if you're somebody who is a POC,
Right.
you feel as though like, oh, I don't have all these things that somebody else who was more privileged had. But it's like, but those taught you values and you were taught lessons, and if you could survive that, you could survive anything, you know.
Right.
And I think that's such a powerful way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and like white men aren't afraid, right? Like
Mm.
white men are getting jobs they're so underqualified for every single day, and they do it with confidence, and they're like, "Yep, I just negotiated my pay. Yep, like I just applied for a VP role even though I don't have any experience in that area," and they get hired. And it's because they have the confidence to show they're not worried about what they've done, because they're confident in what they can do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they don't need a resume that comes all the way to the ground to say, "Oh, I'm more than valuable to do this job." They're like, "No, I know I can do it." Like, and that's it. That's the end of messaging for them.
Yeah, it's kind of like, have you ever heard that thing of fake it till you make it? It's not exactly that, but it's like, it's more about bringing on that confidence and
Right.
being like just so certain in your own ability
Right.
that you don't care if somebody else is like, oh, they'll think this X, Y, and Z of
Right.
you. You know, like I think it's just about like, if you feel like you have the value, then that's already like halfway there.
Yeah.
Right.
I think, therefore I am, right?
There you
Yeah.
go. There you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. But I think, I mean, with what you said, it really, I guess, resonates, because I think a lot of the struggle of what you're saying, I kind of live with, of like,
Mhm.
you know, when you see rejections, right? It's like, oh, like, what was I not good enough? Like, what did I do? Did I not like present myself in a good way? And I think you tend to be a little more self-critical, but I think I agree with what you say, and it's like, but we shouldn't like, you know, attack ourselves for that as much. And I think that's why it really resonates and it connects, because I'm like, you know, this is good to like know, because it's like you can see that I guess for me this is a little more helpful of like, you know, being more confident, because I've spoken on this before, where I feel like I kind of lose my confidence in being in these types of settings, because again because you know,
feel like you stick out, or
yeah, you feel like
Yeah.
you stick out, or I know there was like one time, there was a season where I felt like, you know, the imposter syndrome of like, I don't think I deserve to be here. Like nobody looks like me. Like, so why am I here? But it's just like, I think knowing that you've put in the hard work, and I know that I'm a hardworking person, and
Yeah.
I've done everything that I can to be in these spaces, and I'm very deserving of that as much as everybody else is.
Mhm.
And I think with what you say of like, you know, your non-negotiable is like the way you dress, like, and I feel like I've had that thought recently where I'm like, I wish I could, you know, like, I think the one thing that I think of is like, I wish I could dye my hair and like do these things to
Yeah.
my hair. Like, I wish I could like, I also don't like dressing up professionally. Like, I have no professional clothes, so interviews are always hard for me, because like I don't have anything professional. But I think that's for me, like for me, that I can express myself, even like with my piercing. Sometimes I'm critical of that, of like, do people see me differently because I have like, you know, a
Piercings
septum
and
or
stuff,
something, and or like,
Yeah.
do people see me in this way because of my hair or something? And like, I want to be in that space where I feel comfortable. And if I'm being honest, like the best place that I feel comfortable is here. Like when we do the podcast, like for me, I feel like that's the place where I can express myself. And I think that's why I always like fight for it, of like for us to like be good, because I feel like this is my safe space. Like this is the space where I'm like, I can be myself, and like, and nobody judges me on that, or like, you know, no, like, or I don't really care, and I'm just like, I'm just me, you know.
Yeah.
And I think having those spaces, and the ones that you create and, you know, we create for people, are what also motivates me.
So
you know?
powerful.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying is just like really resonating with me, because I think even like when I saw your page, I'm just like, I think that's very powerful in the fact of like, I don't feel alone. Like I feel like, I think sometimes when I see the statistics, because I was reading about it, of like how many women of color are in like staff rooms and newsrooms and local TV, it's such a small percentage that I was just like, how is that possible when I see, you know, all these like social medias, everybody who I work with, like they're all Latinas in this industry. And how is it that it's still so small? Right. And I think that's the biggest thing and like most powerful thing that I can say from what you're creating is that feeling of like, but there's a lot more people. Like there's people there and they're not being seen. And I love that you guys are, you know, showing that and showcasing that there are those people, you know, and giving them that voice and that representation. So that's just like my side of that all.
It made me think of a lot of stuff. Well, it also made me think like on a tangent, like what even is like who defined what the rules of professionalism are,
right?
You know, because like one of the things that I've thought about recently is like code switching and stuff. I understand, I guess, like when it comes to like cursing and stuff and speaking civil, I understand it there, but like when people show up who are from marginalized communities and they're forced to even change the way that they speak, which is just a natural thing to every human, I feel like that's such an oppressive like a rule that they have to put themselves through. It's like an extra hurdle to jump through. And then it breaks my heart because I don't think that you should ever change who you are in order to fit the standards of what somebody else wants you to be. You know,
it's very like closed-minded, because I think when people talk about like code switching or like, well, don't speak like that, I think there's a lot of you know, aspects that go out the door. Like people live their entire lives, they grew up their entire lives culturally, like they spend maybe 18, 20, 25 years speaking like that, learning like that, engaging with their family like that, and to kind of be told stop doing that, like that's wrong,
that's tough.
Or don't, you know, that's I don't know, that's just so, it's so close-minded, it's so arrogant, it's so privileged, you know, because I mean, even if it was any other way of speaking, like you wouldn't walk up to somebody and be like, stop speaking like that. You know, it's so easy for you to say, to just unlearn, you know, 20 plus years of how you speak,
because it falls in the line of kind of what we're discussing of how like they're basically telling you that your people don't belong here, you know, because a lot of people from the Latin community speak in Spanglish, you know, but you wouldn't consider that professionalism, you know, but that's just a natural way of speaking. So it's discouraging because you think like, oh, I guess like people who speak like me don't belong here.
It's like saying it without saying it, right? It's their way of saying it without saying it. It's like it leads to then, that's why when the push comes to shove and it's time for people who are in corporate, who are of Latin backgrounds, you know, that's why they're more afraid, because like I've never been able to even be who I am. So why would I think that advocating for my community is something they'll even go for? You know, so it just kind of like it all comes together to explain why, you know, things are the way they are.
And then just one last question before we give it off to Brandon. So how can allies that are outside of the Latina community support your mission and contribute to a greater inclusivity in sports and media?
I mean, I guess there's two ways. I think, first of all, like if you work at any place where you make any decisions, which is most of us, whether it's small decisions or large decisions, I really implore everybody to think about the Latino community as not a feel-good, a DEI initiative, but really an economic decision that can really impact your business. I mean, there's 30 million plus Latinas alone, 60 million Latinos in the U.S. We're about 20% of the population. Like, I'm pretty sure that equals like almost as like more people are Latin background than they have curly hair in the United States. And think about how many curly hair products and businesses there are. And so I would just super implore anybody who makes any decisions to think about that cohort and invite people of that demographic to help them make those decisions is probably the second thing. Because I mean, how many times have we seen a big corporation launch a food product, clothing product, and it has like forced Spanglish, and you're like, I would never say that. That like, where did that? What? Or like a flavor that they claim is from like one part of our community or region, and you're like, I don't even know what that is, and why is it in English? And that's not. you know? And so it's like, think about that demographic, but then invite people, if you're not of that background, invite people of that background to educate you on how to best communicate to that community and to that demographic, because we can spot it from a mile away.
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
Again, I'm Cuban. Which like people put us all in like one big box, but it's a very different culture than Mexican culture, or people from Guatemala, or people from Argentina or Colombia. And you have to understand those nuances, because what might work for a Cuban American doesn't work for a Mexican American, and also regionally, right? Like what works for a Mexican American in LA might be very different than what works for someone like my co-founder Jennifer, who is Mexican American in Texas. Those are two different worlds apart.
True.
Yeah.
So I'm going on a tangent here, but I think that's really what it is like, think about us, but then also invite people who look like us and who can have some of those nuances, and innovate with them and not for them.
Yeah, that's so true too. Because just speaking on the tangent that you were kind of going on, I think it is interesting because I think there is a what is it called? I think there's an actual term for it, but it's like it's where people lump all Latin American identities together.
Yeah, monolith.
Yeah. So like, you forget the nuances of it, and it speaks to what you're saying of how like that's why it's important to have those people in the same room, because you'll see this weird representation of a group that doesn't even exist, basically.
Yeah.
It's like, so who is this for?
Right.
Like, it's literally for a group that doesn't exist.
Right. And then it's so frustrating because they say, oh, well, we did it and it didn't work and Latinos didn't show up. And I'm like, well, yeah, because you spelled things wrong, or because you're saying it in a weird tone, or because that doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, a self-fulfilling prophecy for them, where they quote unquote try. We don't show up because like it doesn't speak to us. And therefore they say, well, we already did that. Or they translate it in Spanish, which most of us now as a younger generation are not fully bilingual, might know some Spanish, and then they get it wrong, and then it's our fault. And then they say, no, thank you, we already did that. We're going to go to this cohort, or we're going to go at business as usual.
Yeah. I think it's funny too, because what you were speaking on of how like in movies or like in media sometimes they do the Spanglish thing, and it's like,
very forced.
Me and my
abuela. That's like the corny version of it.
That's what I thought of right when she said it. I was like, me and my abuela.
Right.
I like the other one. I've seen them on TikTok where it's like when a character is speaking about their family, but he's from the US, and it's like, we have to think about our family. It's like, but then they're Latino. We have to think about our familia.
Brandon. One thing that I was really curious about as you were speaking was what drew you to sports, like in particular? Like, have you always been a fan? Is there something about sports that you really were like, I want to see changed?
Yeah.
What in particular?
Well, I mean, I think I mentioned, like, when I grew up a sports fan, I watched every sport growing up, even though my parents weren't. But I think really, like, what really drew me is, like, when I was 16, I came out, and I was, like, probably one of, like, 700 kids in the entire high school to be out, or at least that I knew of. And that was a really lonely time. The queer acceptance has been a lot better as the generations have gone on, and hopefully it just gets better and better. But when I was in it, it was kind of when I had just come out, it was still kind of a taboo topic. And so it made me feel just different. I mean, I was already different for a lot of reasons, but it made me feel even more different. And what I love about sports, and I think all of us can also relate to, is sports is so inclusive and communal. So when I played for an hour, which I played soccer growing up, I felt like everybody else because it kind of mutes the world. And I think the same thing can be when you're watching a game, nothing else matters. Especially if it's your team, or if you're at a game, like suddenly all these people you don't know are your allies, and you're all cheering for the same thing, and it feels like a very community-driven thing, and it makes you feel less alone, even though the person next to you might not even understand who you are, what you do, or doesn't even know who you are, but suddenly you start high-fiving people, you start hugging people, cheersing people, and there's something so beautiful about that. And so that's what I've always loved about sports, and so that's what made me fall in love with sports and the business sports, and then again, knowing what I went through, I just didn't want others to ever feel alone in sports again. And so that was one of the biggest things that drew me to wanting to build this.
Wow. I think on that note, you mentioned something earlier that I really liked, where you said that you were kind of on the intersectionality of a few things.
Sure.
Where you said that you're part of the LGBTQ community. You mentioned how you're a woman and you're Latina. And the sports community, like the sports world, I would say, like as a fan, there's been a lot of progress, but there's also with progress a lot of pushback.
Right.
You know, you see how the NFL and the UFC can be very conservative, very close-minded. You see baseball can be like that. There's the controversy in the Olympics with, you know, some really ignorant and closed-minded things, you know, and being that you're part of three, you know, I would say marginalized groups that I can see the sports community being very, you know, apprehensive about, you know, opening their minds up to.
Yeah.
How do you stay motivated, you know, when you receive pushback from that community?
Well, I mean, I think as a founder CEO, like the biggest way that I stay motivated is our community. So when we've only been in business for about a year, and we've cultivated a community of over 30,000 women across the country who, for the first time, really feel seen and safe in sports through our content because they've attended our programming for whatever reason. And so almost daily, myself or my co-founder Jennifer, we get an inbound of an email or a message saying what this means to them. And I think, you know, if I can make if we as a company can make a difference in somebody's life by having very little resources, still being a startup, only being a year in business, and it can mean so much to that one person, what can we do if we continue to grow and we continue to innovate and we continue to advocate? And so, like, every day, like, you know, I think of us as almost like people who are out in the streets, you know, fighting for what they want. And, like, every day the group just gets bigger and bigger, and the streets just get fuller and fuller. And so the bigger that we are, the more unignorable that we are. So that's what motivates me, is, like, every single day, one more person or however many people join our community and raise their hands and raise their fists with us. And at this point, I feel a responsibility, not just to do it for myself, but for the women who I've galvanized and we've galvanized over the last year, who are fighting now for the same cause.
I think that's really important to hear. I mean, I think for me, it's very encouraging to hear. Because like I said earlier, I'm a big sports fan. I come from a big sports family.
Yeah.
You know, and I think at times it can feel, at least, again, as a fan, like discouraging, disheartening to kind of see how sports can be. You know, there's a lot of positives, like not to take away from it at all. But there's times where it can get, you know, a little bit hard to watch how that community can engage with, you know, the LGBTQ community, with women. Like you see it with the WNBA. You know, they've always been talented, but now it's getting such a massive appeal now. And that's good, but you also see a lot of the pushback, like with the NFL, with Colin Kaepernick a few years ago, about how he was protesting, you know, the treatment of his community by the police. And you saw how the NFL really reacted to that. You know, the MLB can sometimes be very homophobic, you know, and I guess for me, it's a positive thing to see. Like, I'm glad that there's people like yourself who are pushing back against that. Because I think for a long time I felt like, man, like, the sports world is just not going to change, is it? It's just too, but I'm glad to see that that's not true.
Yeah, because I imagine, well, I'm curious to ask you, because you grew up, you know, always admiring sports, and I'm sure you saw the signs where it felt like sometimes somebody who's your identity wouldn't be accepted. How did you continue to still be a fan? Because I feel like, at least for someone who's not part of the LGBTQ community, I feel like that would discourage me to an extent.
Yeah, you know, I would say, I think a couple things. I think what's been really nice is women's sports has done a phenomenal job of making the fan experience to be incredibly inclusive. It's almost been like everybody who's been denied or felt othered in traditional sports is, they've created a safe space for those outliers, even though they're not outliers. I mean, you know, they do a really good job of speaking to women of color, the LGBTQ community. And so I've always found a really nice home in women's sports, because they've built with their community as they've grown. But I think, like, but that's what's funny about sports is it is so emotional that you can be a fan of something and feel so proud of something, even though you know that you are a secondary citizen, because it's such an emotional connection. And sometimes sports has an emotional connection because it comes from your family, and maybe it's your dad was a Niner fan, and so now you're a Niner fan, or because it's regional, and or you're a Dodger fan because you grew up in LA and it's part of LA culture to be a Dodger fan. And so I think those are the things that have kind of kept me grounded. But what I've always found a home in is women's sports, and I think they're doing a phenomenal job of being incredibly inclusive to that fan experience.
Okay.
I completely agree. I feel like for a long time I won't speak for other women's sports, but I mean specifically with the WNBA, there for a long time, there was a lot of ignorance surrounding that league, So I'm really glad to hear that.
Yeah.
On that note, I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about how does it feel to kind of be the representation yourself as well? Because I know you talked about highlighting the stories for representation, but I'm sure like as a young girl, you were kind of looking for people in the position that you are now. How does it feel to now be in that position?
It feels weird. It feels like a responsibility. It feels like this great responsibility that I carry very with a lot of pride. But there's a lot of fear, like especially when you are the first media company, or really the first company to ever really center this and powerful cohort of women and advocate for them. There's a great responsibility to get it right, but I also I'm not going to. I don't understand the nuances of every single lived experience or Latina lived experience, and so it's a delicate balance of feeling very prideful and very, very proud of what Jennifer and I have built, and we carry that responsibility very deeply with us. But I think there's also some fear. And when you're the first, people look to you as like the person to guide them into something, to the unknown. And it feels like every day we're walking to a dark forest, and I'm just telling people it's going to be great. We're going to find the light. Hopefully, but I have to keep a smile on my face.
Yeah.
But what I hope though, and I say this trepidatiously, but I think what we really want to do is build a ripple effect. If we are still the only media company 3-4 years from now, then we haven't done our job. We haven't been loud enough, because we should have other people popping up thinking about this cohort, whether does it have to be a media company? Not necessarily. It can be a merch company. It can be any of these things, because we can't be the only ones. And I think that's part of the problem is we feel this great responsibility because we're still the only ones. And, it's our hope that people start to see how powerful this demographic is and how much they show up, and start to innovate alongside us and grab our, we can link arms together in this hypothetical march down the street and be bigger and better, because that's how we make change. Is we can't make change alone.
Yeah, I like what you said about responsibility, and how you mentioned it feels like walking into a dark forest a lot. I like that a lot, because I don't know how Steve and Julie feel, but when it came to the podcast in itself,
right?
I personally never expected the podcast to have the tone and the subject matter that it has now. I'm grateful for it and I love it. But to kind of be this kind of hub of representation, when representation is not a new thing, but I don't know how you'd say it, but it's
like a new wave. I know
a
what
new
you
wave
mean,
of
yeah.
representation, In a lot of ways, that responsibility is it's a lot of responsibility, because I think there's a pressure to kind of get things right.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people behind you are looking to be okay, well, let's see how they do it.
Right.
Yeah.
And rightfully so. I get it. So I like that a lot. And then on that note, one more question before I hand it off to Steve.
Sure.
What's been the most important, or at least one of the most important lessons that you've learned from navigating the sports industry that wasn't built, or at least didn't really feel built for, people like us who wasn't so accommodating or welcoming to people from marginalized groups?
The biggest lesson, I think there's been a few, and that maybe it's just more general lessons. But I in particular didn't have any sports experience working in sports. I built a PR agency. We worked with a lot of beauty brands and all kinds of things, but actually sports was probably one of the only verticals that we never really worked on. And so I came in it really blindly, but I think because I came in blind, like I was able to look at things a lot differently because I had a different point of view. But I think what's been the most helpful is finding those early people that champion you and that make something less known easier to navigate. Because it is difficult. And going back to the analogy of like the dark forest is like, you know, I'm the leader of this company. And so the last thing I want to do is be on a call and ask questions that make me look ignorant or less known. But when you have a safe community that you can speak to and say, hey, I have a meeting with so-and-so, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Or what does that look like? Or how does the MLB do business? Or how does the NWSL structure their organization so that I know who I'm talking to? And that's made it so much easier because you have this safe space of community of women or other people who make it a little bit easier to go into those rooms and feel powerful.
Wow. That was really well said.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. My first question, I have two questions that touch more on your life before we'll get into drafted, but
Sure.
There's some things that you said that I found really interesting. The first I thought was really interesting is that you are adopted and you have Cuban parents. How did that feel creating like a solid cultural identity from that?
You know, it's funny. When people ask me what I am, I always say Cuban. Like that is really how I identify. I've never gone back to Paraguay. I know sadly very little about it because I grew up in a home where being Cuban American was highly celebrated, and I am so proud of that. Like when I speak Spanish, I sound Cuban, and so I take that with a lot of pride because, you know, I think culture and how you identify also has to do with how you were raised and the people around you. And so while I'm not born in Cuba, but I was raised that way, there's a lot of pride because that's where my grandparents are from and the stories that come out of it. But it's funny now that I'm a little bit older, I am kind of leaning into some curiosities about where my origin story is, because I'm learning that two can be true, you know, and I think that's probably the biggest lesson for me is growing up. I always felt like you had to pick one, right? You had to pick one thing that you were going to like stand your ground on, and that's what you were, whether it was my identity or whether it was my culture. But I'm learning, and I think the beauty of building a company like this is that like it's reflective of who you are, and like it teaches you things almost like when you're looking at a mirror for a long time, you start to see things differently. And that's what building this company has been for me, like my unbecoming and my becoming all at the same time, because I'm learning to love and accept and be curious or endlessly curious about all of these nuances that are me. So I guess the long answer to that is I'm still learning and I'm still navigating, but I think who isn't, you know? That's
It's a lifelong journey.
100%.
Yeah, it's funny because you led into my next question, which is how do you stay grounded in your personal identity when you navigate the often commercialized nature of the sports world?
You know, I don't. I'm gonna be honest. Like, I don't. Like, I, for better or for worse, I no longer allow rooms like that to identify me. And sometimes that makes me the outlier. Okay, it is what it is. And that is something that took a lot of time to overcome. And there are certain rooms that still feel incredibly intimidating when I look different, when I feel different, when I have a different story than most people in that room. But I frankly just, the best version of me is the one that loves me, and I can only love me when I allow myself to be who I am. And as a founder CEO, I don't have the privilege, unfortunately, to put down my founder CEO hat and put on my Karina hat, because every day is both. And so I have to use who I am as a superpower and not have those as two different identities, because that's what makes me wonderful and great, is when I am who I am. And so I don't, and some people thrive in being able to code switch and say, okay, I'm going to turn on this version of me and then this version of me. But unfortunately, for better or for worse, every single day you get all of me beginning and end, and that's just the truth of it all.
That's amazing. Yeah, I resonate. That resonates so much with me, and I relate so much because I think that like I often compare my experience to other like Mexican American experiences, and I'm like, am I really being a true, authentic Mexican American?
Yeah.
But recently, as I've gotten older, I realized like I am who I am. That's just who I am. I can't put put on a performance for somebody else.
Right.
Yeah.
I have to just be who I am authentically.
Right.
And getting more into Drafted, one of the main things that I've seen from going on your website and from what I even saw in your bio is that you guys mention a lot about working at the intersection of culture and storytelling. So I wanted to know directly, like, what does that mean in the context of sports? Like, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, it means I think for me, like, I think in boxes. Like, when you think about Hispanic Heritage Months, they are focused on one type of story. But for us, like, we are focused on that intersection of culture and stories every single day. So what that means to us is that we celebrate stories that are through our lived culture every single day. So tangible examples of that can be something recently that a Latina athlete did or accomplished that we want to celebrate, or it can be looking at something that maybe necessarily isn't Latin, let's say even just a sport, and talking about that through our cultural lived experiences, because as a fan, a Latina fan, I have a different experience watching soccer than maybe a white woman does. And there's nuances to my fandom that are unique to me that aren't for that person, and vice versa. And so I think you have to infuse culture in order to tell proper and authentic, I hate that word, but authentic and representative stories. If you're not infusing culture and allowing your own bias, which is okay in some ways, to tell and lead that story, then you're not getting full representation in the stories that exist.
Yeah, I agree. Why do you hate the word authentic?
I think it's a word that's used primarily, probably in a more corporate setting, that is about being true to oneself, but it's a word that's said but isn't always practiced on, and that's really frustrating sometimes when you people are saying, oh, it's come as your authentic self. Like we were just talking about dress codes, right?
Yeah.
And identity. Come as your authentic self. We celebrate authenticity, but you walk in with jeans and they're like, we don't do that. Or you walk in with like, a Selena t-shirt and they're like, no, we don't. That's a little bit outside of what we do here. And you're like, but that's authentic. I'm confused. And so I think that word authentic can sometimes be
I get it.
harmful.
Yeah.
Because people say it, but they don't really mean
They
it.
don't
It's
really
like
mean it.
be authentic to an appropriate level.
Exactly.
Yeah, I get you.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Was there something in your earlier life that you saw or heard in sports that made you feel represented and that you try to recreate through Drafted?
I think for me, when I think about my early state, like my early fandom, I think the first time I ever saw representation or felt represented was when I saw Marta play. So I don't know if you know who Marta is. Marta is probably the most prolific soccer player to ever play the game. She's this incredible Brazilian player. She dark skin and she wore this like bright red lipstick and was amazing and is amazing. She's still playing. She just retired from the Brazilian national team.
Oh, wow.
But she's been playing for 20 plus years, has gone to 6 World Cups, I think, now has a FIFA entire award named after her. But she was probably the only person of darker skin that looked anything like me. And when I saw her play, I was like, oh my God, that's me. Even though it wasn't, and I'm never going to be as good as her. But I think that was a moment where I was like, oh, like, that's me, or that's a version of me. And she was born in Brazil, which is right next to Paraguay. And that carries with me a lot. And I'm so glad the next generation has so many more versions of that and not just one. But I think that for me was like an awakening that like sports was a place for me, because I finally saw someone that resembled just a little bit based on her story and her cultural background of me.
That's so sweet. I think that's so sweet because I think I really have a soft spot for things that make people feel less alone.
Right.
So I think that was like the perfect answer of what I wanted to hear. But it also kind of goes into my next question, which is how do you measure success when it comes to Drafted? Like not even just on an economic level, but like on a personal level, how do you measure that Drafted is being successful?
I mean, day to day, I think impact is hard. Impact is harder to quantify than, traditional business growth. But I think the ways that I can quantify it, or at least you know, see the progress that I think is, again, in those messages that we receive from strangers. Like, it's not coming from my cousins, hey, you're doing great. Like, it's coming from some girl in Wisconsin who might be the only Latina playing soccer, and she's like, this is so cool to go to a page or attend virtual events, where I'm not the only, because I've been the only. So I think that is one way that just continues to drive us, and I think is a tangible impact. But I think the second part of it is, like I said, is we can't be the only. We really can. I might regret this one day when I'm like, what the hell? Why are all these people? No. And I'm sure I'm gonna play this back and be like, stupid. Why did I say that? But it's true, right? Like, if we are the only company that cares about this demographic, then we didn't do our job advocating enough to make other people care, to want to put money, dollars, time, and investment into building that ecosystem with us.
Yeah, it that resonates also with me because of what we do with the podcast. Kind of how Brandon was saying, I sometimes get messages more now than ever before since we started.
Yeah.
I get messages just from people, like from Latinos, from places like I never would have imagined.
So
Like,
cool.
they're like, I'm from Iowa, I'm from, you know, wherever, and they're like, I'm like the only Latino in my town, and like I hear you guys, and I feel so like seen, and I feel like I'm part of your guys' friend group. And I feel like that actually is such a bigger measure than me than any numbers of follower counting or like views. Because like the fact that there's a real world impact, there's even just one person out there who feels a connection or just feels like whatever we're doing is really speaking to them. I feel like that's like a whole amount of success. Because like,
absolutely.
because like you said, like people who know you, that's like obviously you appreciate it, you know, telling them like, oh, I'm proud of you, or what you're doing is really cool.
Sure.
But it's different when it's a complete stranger who knows nothing about
They owe you nothing. They
Yeah.
owe you nothing. And they went, I mean, think about it. Like, we're all consumers of things. When we've bought products or listened to something, how often do you go and message the company that you bought a product from, or you listen to, and we're like, this has changed my life? Like, hardly ever, right? But unless it really does make an impact, then you go out of your way to search their email and to send that message, not knowing if you're going to get anything back, but that's how much it means to you. So think about the fact, like, think about that behavior, and other people are doing that for you every single day. That is wild and so humbling and such an incredible privilege.
Yeah, and so motivating too. And like, so motivating. It's like, I can't give up, because there's a community now out there that's building and is actually seeing what we're doing, and is super appreciative of it.
I think it really reminds me, like, I kept thinking about when we did our live show, and we actually had like a fan who traveled like from Georgia to just come see us.
Crazy.
And she talked to me, and she was telling me that she really feels like connected, you know, like she feels seen, she feels heard. She's like, I listen to you guys in my car, and I'm like talking back to you guys. Like, yeah. And I think, it's just very motivating, and it's beautiful. It's just very beautiful and like encouraging to keep doing what you're doing, because it's like there's some sort of impact. You may not see it every day, but it's like you're making an impact to people here and there, and you never know, you know. And I think that's very beautiful to see, and how I've said, like, even for you guys, at least for me, like, that's seeing that I'm not alone, right? Like, there's this whole community, and we could connect. And I think that's what even makes it more beautiful, is that we can connect even across countries, and like 100%. Even across, you know, just different places. Yeah. And you never know, you know, who's actually listening to you, who's never know, you know, who you're being there for. Right. And I think that's the beautiful part of knowing all that.
Yeah, it is funny too what you said about how like maybe you'll regret it in the future, because there has been other podcasts that have now come up that are like similar to us, and I don't see it as a rivalry, but I think it's just funny that like, oh wow, like there you go, you become the representation and you pay it forward. People pop up. But kind of moving more into my questions. So is there any misconceptions that people have about Drafted that you like to try to dispel?
Yes, that we are a nonprofit or an organization. And I understand, you know, again, like what I was saying earlier, oftentimes Latino or like marginalized groups, any company that is advocating and wanting to innovate or drive change for them is often seen as a feel good. Like, oh, look at those people, they're doing, how cute. Like, you know, that's so nice. And we are very intentional about being a for-profit business that has high ambitions. Because we're not a feel-good opportunity. We're an economic opportunity. Yes, it feels good to serve people who have been ignored. Of course, we're an impact-driven company, but we're not a nonprofit. And so so often, I think it's getting better now, but I think at the very beginning, people referred to us as an organization or asked, can we even make money doing this? And, just don't see it as a viable company because they see that demographic as so niche, and because of the media stereotypes that we've gotten about how our community is something to donate to or to feel good to or to give out handouts to because we have less. And we were like, absolutely not. We are not that way. We are driving change, and we're going to do it while we make money and build a really big business.
Yeah, I like that. Go ahead.
I again,
I know
in a weird way, I can, we can relate to that because I feel like it's difficult to quantify into words,
right?
But I feel like a lot of the air with, I would say, just certain people who want to work with us, right, on a business standpoint, is like, oh, well, here's this opportunity. Like, we don't have to pay you guys, right? And it's there's kind of almost this, like, of course we're doing this, like, because we care. Mm-hmm. Of course we want to help. Of course all of that. But it's almost like this air of, you're just doing that out of the kindness of your heart, right? You don't want anything back, Right. And in a weird way, it's almost like people are saying without saying, like, you should you should feel grateful that you're even in this space, and that's it. But in a lot of ways, it's like, what? Like,
it's like belittling.
Yeah, like, what do you mean? Like, of course we want to make money.
Work.
And it's almost like you're made to feel kind of selfish for expecting that, but it's like everybody else does.
Right.
Everybody else, every other podcast or business or whatever it is like with the intention of course. I mean, there's bills to pay. There's people to support. Like, of course I want to make money, Right. So I 100% understand.
Yeah, like you said, like they give you that impression of like, oh, that's cute. Yeah, like that's really cute. And it's like, what? I mean, like we're still like a business model at the end of the day. You don't have to belittle our struggle. We're doing this because we are good people, but it doesn't mean like
we're not putting work in it.
Yeah.
We're not putting our time into.
There's no energy or work. Yeah. But I guess speaking that into my final question, what do you want the legacy of Drafted to be from now on to beyond?
I mean, I think I've said it a few times. I want our legacy to be a ripple effect. To be a ripple effect to, again, either other folks to see this as a viable demographic to build and innovate against. But I also think I want this to be a ripple effect to inspire other women and other Latinas around the country to just know that anything is possible. Because, again, like my story about Marta changed my worldview. And so how many times over can we do that to change the worldview of women or Latinas across the country who don't have access or don't see themselves, that maybe see some version of themselves for the first time and then say, okay, I'm going to go after this thing. Mm-hmm. And that's hard to quantify because I will never know how many people saw that and actually did something. But that's what I want our legacy to be, is to be that. But I also, more importantly, I want to be a company that started with a mission and never wavered on that mission. Because a lot of times a company like ours has great intentions to make things more equitable or more representative. And then along the way, they start to dilute that mission because other things start to come up, or because they get outside pressure, or because business, whatever. I think the greatest thing that we can do is stick to that mission and never waver on it, because otherwise, like, if we're not doing it, who will?
Yeah. Like, stay focused, stay locked in.
Yeah.
Really well said. Thank you for coming on the show, by the way.
Thank you for having me. This is wonderful.
Yeah, this is really great. There was a lot of value in this that I think I'll probably linger over for the next few hours.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, you have a really well-articulate way of speaking, and I think a lot of our audience is going to really appreciate that.
I appreciate it.
Brandon, Julie, you guys have anything to say?
Well, I just wanted to say thank you again for coming on the show. A lot what you said really did resonate with me. And I feel like it's even more encouraging of like building that confidence within myself.
Yeah.
I think it's just really hard. And I think we sometimes forget, about just different things. And I think this is just a reminder of like to just keep going and keep doing like what we're doing and what I'm specifically doing in a lot of these different spaces. 'Cause again, I think I get so attached to like the negative that I forget all the positives through it. And I think this is just a really great reminder of just like how life is, and to just keep going, and you know, you're never alone, and there's just a lot of impact that you can make and people make on you, and that's really beautiful. And again, what you guys are creating is really it's really beautiful, and it's really inspiring to see. And hopefully, you know, it goes great for you guys, and I'll always be supporting that, and it's just really great to see.
You too. I mean, I think we need all voices and all stories, and I think what you all are doing is amazing. And the fact that like there are people all over the country listening to your stories and resonating, like you are all making a difference too. Even though it can feel hard, but I think it takes all voices. And I think it's amazing that you are all vulnerable enough every week to speak on topics that are uncomfortable sometimes for our community.
Yeah.
But you make it feel approachable, and that makes a lot of change too.
Thank you.
Thank you. That means a lot. It really does.
Yeah.
I completely agree with everything Steve and Julie said, and I think it's really inspiring. It's good to see. It gives me optimism for the future, because like I was saying, sometimes it can be a little defeating to see how the sports community can be, but I'm very happy to see that there's, you know, people people boldly taking up space, and you know, going against that norm. Before I send everybody off, again, thank you so much to Karina for joining us. I got to do a shout out to all of our patrons. Shout out to Yuel, Jada Chicano, Angel Zamaron, Ila Quintero, El Verdugo de Pasadena, Sarah without an H, Stephen Carbajal, Carla Corazon, and I am Potato Tots. Thank you so much for supporting our show. If anybody ever wants to join the Patreon, our link is always in the description. Again, thank you so much for Karina joining us. We really hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you guys next week.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.